A lot of characters have pasts which define them as people. Be it their tragedies or their successes, it's usually their driving force for their actions in the future. And this is one of the aspects in writing characters that Hidehiko Araki fucking shines in. He has written so many well-done villain characters, let alone characters, throughout all of JoJo and most of his other works, that it's hard to nail down, like, the best. But I think one of the better minor antagonists who isn't part of an Italian hitman squad and blends a perfect amount of villainy and tragedy is the war veteran himself, Axl Rowe, and his stand, Civil War. The Civil War arc in Axl Rowe is one of the more interesting dynamic arcs in Steel Ball Run. It's also really fun to dissect, in my opinion. Looking into the logistics of a minor antagonist stand was a lot of fun. I didn't do a lot of it in this video, but I did more of it in another video that if you want to go check out, it's right here. Though, before we even talk about a stand, we need to understand the stand user, the man behind the stand. And let's start off with Axl Rowe's name. His namesake comes from the Guns N' Roses lead vocalist Axl Rose. Him having this name, I can't really think of much of a connection besides the fact that his stand's name is Civil War and that's a song from Guns N' Roses, but we'll get more into that later. It's also possible that Araki is throwing some shade at Axl Rose himself, casting him as this dishonorable soldier, because, I mean, Axl Rose is very well known for just being a huge asshole. But let's get more into the man that is Axl Rowe. Axl was a Confederate soldier enlisted in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War and was given a job of being a lookout for a remote town, possibly Vicksburg, if I had to guess, because that's when it was lost around 1863. Now, the reason I assume that he's a Confederate and not a Union soldier is based off his outfit and the coloring done by Saoirse, which, I mean, technically isn't the canon coloring. It's the only way to help us distinguish between the soldiers. Now, you see, where I got this idea was because when we see Funny Valentine, he's in a blue soldier's uniform, and Funny Valentine was part of the Union. He became the president. And Axl Rowe, in his flashback, is in a green uniform cowering from blue soldiers. Also, Axl describes his side as being on the losing side of the war, and I think that's evidence enough to show that he was indeed a Confederate. Now, growing up when he was younger, he wanted to be a musician. He cited Antonin Dvorak as his main aspiration for the life he wanted to lead. Though, one night, he awoken to the sound of soldiers passing underneath his post. He did not light the signal lamp that he was instructed to out of fear that he might die. Instead, he sat back and drank and watched as the town that he was meant to defend burnt to the ground. He claimed that this was the day that his soul broke, and in the added amount of guilt and sadness piling up over the years, Axl Rowe finally formed his own stand. This is also the first time, but isn't the last time, that guilt would manifest itself as a stand within the Steel Ball Run universe, helping us understand more and more how stands might manifest without a corpse part in this universe. Now, the stand that Axl Rowe did obtain was ironically named after the source of all his grief and sadness. This stand's name is Civil War. Civil War is a humanoid stand with a very interesting design. As Araki states in the JoJo Veller, a stand where the ability is the main idea. For its design, I think I focused on letting the head have impact. I felt like a distorted metal mask. I felt like I was picturing plants for the legs. They ended in roots. Because Araki was focusing more on the abilities instead of the design when it came to the overall arc for Civil War, I feel that only some parts might have some actual historical backing to them. Like, the metal mask might be in reference to the famous prisoner of the King Louis XIV timed era, the Man in the Iron Mask. This prisoner was never truly identified and he was moved between prison to prison and kept silent. He has then been equated to horrible deeds that should go unnamed or unmentioned, which is very similar to Axl Rowe's past. Now, for the detail about the legs being roots, this could be the fact that Axl finds his sins are rooted within his soul, and therefore he can never move away from them. They are rooted to him. And that's all the design elements I can really think of for this stand's design. So let's move on to stats. Its stats are Destructive Power none, C in Speed, C in Range, Durability B, but this is actually more referring to the membrane it creates with one of its powers and not the stand itself. It's C in Precision and Developmental Potential is also none. Now for its abilities, it's something called Physically Indestructible. Now I know it has a B in Durability and that usually doesn't equivalent to Physically Indestructible, but The stand itself is basically indestructible, but its counter is that the physical form of the stand is not really involved with the stand ability itself. The real ability of the stand is the crushing power of guilt. Civil War's primary ability is to manifest objects a target has either left behind or feels guilty about. These objects then attach themselves and move through the target's body, creating a thin membrane that slowly engulfs them. The membrane then gradually shrinks and crushes them, which is a literal, physical manifestation of the target's guilt. And once the target makes contact with an object, they instantly remember how they sacrificed it and why they feel guilty about it. This ability does have a pretty strong weakness, which is water, which dissolves the membrane almost instantaneously, possibly in reference to the cleansing power of baptization, which could play into the fact that Axl Rowe is a pretty religious man. Now, its final ability is kind of a secret. It's called Rebirth Through Guilt. Only if the user is killed and their murderer feels guilty towards killing them, then does the user get brought back to life and their guilt and sacrifices are then shifted onto the murderer and begin attacking them. However, if the user kills the enemy and feels guilty about it, the situation is immediately reversed and the enemy is revived. I find the final power of this stand to be vastly interesting, because not only is the person revived, but they also leave behind an older corpse, which then we reach a philosophical question, the paradox of Theseus's ship. I went more into on another video, and I might redo it sometime in the future, but tell me about that. Do you want me to do that in the future? Let me know. But the most interesting thing about this stand is the musical aspect of Civil War. The name Civil War comes from the Guns N' Roses song called Civil War, which has a strong anti-war message into it, but the interesting aspect of this stand is the connection to the lyrics themselves. Because the lyrics begin with, "Look at you young men fighting," which reflected through Gyro's sins from his past battles, represented by his steel balls, and his direct conflict with Civil War stand form, or Johnny actively fighting his past sins instead of actually being trapped by them like everyone else was. Then you have "Look at your woman crying," reflected through both Hot Pants' sacrifice of her brother in a panic to a bear, which she is shameful and regretting much later on when she's forced to relive those tragic memories. And then after that you have this, which is "Look at your young man dying," which is reflected by Johnny's dead brother Nicholas. Also, Johnny actually dies in this arc, and he's the youngest of the group. But lastly, we have "The way they've always done before." This is more referencing the fact that the stand resurfaces both faces and memories for the guilty. From that string of lyrics, we move on to the next, which is "Look at the hate we're breeding, look at the fear we're feeding, look at the lives we're leading." This is all Johnny accepting himself and learning to not waver when he acts. He needs to act with killing intent, or else he'll waver and fall into the fear of losing his life that he desires. He needs to be willing to kill for what he wants. And then you end this string of lyrics with "The way I've always done before," calling back to when Johnny was willing to kill. He almost used killing intent against Ringo earlier in this part. And moving on from that, we can say the next set of lyrics is more about Axl Rowe himself. "My hands are tied and the billions shift from side to side." These are more directly symbolized by the souls of the dead being shifted between Johnny and Axl Rowe during their fight. And Axl Rowe doesn't even control these sins, he just lets them manifest. He even gives his opponent the benefit of the doubt by telling them his weakness. And from there we have, "And the wars goes on with the brainwashed pride, the love of God and human rights." From this, we get the brainwashed one is basically Axl Rowe and his actions for the corpse. But we also get that he has an actual pride for his country, as he was given this mission by his president. Because Funny Valentine is a representation of human rights. His actions are to protect the world, but most importantly, his country. And then from there, all of these things are swept aside, the bloody hands that time can't deny, they wash away your genocide, the history hides the lies of our civil wars. This whole segment, this whole set of lyrics, how disposable Axl Rowe really is in the end. His actions were swept aside by bloody hands time can't deny. These bloody hands obviously belong to Funny Valentine, as he guns down Axl Rowe trying to save Johnny. And therefore, he doesn't feel any guilt for killing Axl Rowe. But it's also possibly due to the fact that he is killing a Confederate as he was a Union member. He also used Axl Rowe and moved on, the genocide being the fight between Johnny and Valentine, which is a direct consequence of Axl Rowe's actions. These are only a few lyrics from the song Civil War, and if you really want me to, I could break down the whole song, because just about every lyric correlates with something in the arc of Civil War. I think Araki pulled all the stops here, and this stand fight's awesome and I love it. And if you enjoyed this video and want to help me make more videos like it, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MeddieNotTheBadGuy. And if you want something to take your mind off of some guilt you might be feeling, then go to Shimonetta.com, or go to Funimation.com/Shimonetta, a boring world where the concept of dirty jokes doesn't exist, and get yourself a nice copy. Help get your mind off. It's more than just a guilty pleasure. And after that, have a lovely day.